And hello and welcome everyone. Happy Friday, wherever you are. Uh, we are coming to you live from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And I am your host, Coach Elex, and with me, the one and only
Stephen, the medium.
Stephen the Medium also happens to be my better half, my husband, and my
I am.
partner, and everything. And my literally my better half. He makes me better at everything. So I'm so happy you're back with me.
Well, I'm so happy
Again.
too.
So Stephen, how are you? What's going on? Tell us before we get into the nitty gritty of today's show. Um,
Well, I'm
tell.
fantastic because yesterday we had such a fantastic night at the Ocean Edge Golf Resort in Brewster, Mass, and in courtesy of 99.9 The Q radio station in Rebecca. So I was asked to be the guest for their listener appreciation day, and it was 5 to 7, and they did giveaways, and they had some light bites and drinks, and it was fantastic. And of course I got to do several readings, and I also brought a note that was pretty phenomenal. So, and then you and I had to get to have, we've never been there, so we went for dinner, and the dinner was amazing.
Yeah, it was actually it was a beautiful evening. The weather could not have been better. It was a little chilly for me, but I
Oh,
know for
come
you,
on.
it was perfect. Well, because Stephen, for those of you who don't know Stephen, he is already celebrating that Halloween is around the corner, that fall is around the corner, and in another month he'll be celebrating Christmas. So that's the kind of guy that I live with. But it was a fabulous event, and I know that the people who were there enjoy getting messages from their loved ones, and it's so great to be part of that and to just actively see how what you do makes a difference. And Stephen and I always think that the work that we both do is very synergistic, very different because I don't speak to dead people. I actually speak to people who are alive. Um, Sometimes they sound a little dead, but they're alive. But but our goal is the same. Our goal is through what we do, through the conversations that we have, to really inspire them to live their best life. And from that perspective, I really do feel that we have a very synergistic energy
I
happening.
agree.
So,
I
so
definitely agree.
yeah, so today we are going to talk about listening, and I love this conversation. Stephen and I, a few weeks back, we talk about what are some of the topics that we feel are going to be received well by our listeners. And of course, Stephen says, communication is always a good topic. And, when I think of communication, I think of, listening, and how listening, it's very different from hearing, but how listening actually can impact our ability to have great conversations, to have effective conversations, to really begin to connect with one another in a much deeper way. And today we're going to talk about what great listeners do and some of the things that you could do to listen better, to kind of step into somebody else's world better. So, Stephen, when I talk about listening, what is that? What do you hear? Pun intended.
I thought about this morning after my readings, and I had like an hour before the show started, and I was just kind of like thinking about the theme of the show. And it's kind of interesting how you talked about us being in sync, because like the first thing I think about as a listener is to be present. And I'm, I always have these conversations as a medium, whether I'm teaching classes or just talking to people, doing readings, that you got to be present. You got to be present. You got to be present for a multitude of reasons. And I think for me anyway, listening starts there, because if you're present, then I think everything else you need to be as a good listener falls into place. If you're not present, I think then nothing else can fall under that, if that makes any sense.
That makes perfect sense. And again, being present is one of those active things that we need to do. In fact, I talk about how being emotionally intelligent helps you be a better listener. And when I talk about emotional intelligence, for those of you, I mean, emotional intelligence is a very recognizable subject today. It wasn't, a few years back, but today most people understand what that means. Emotional intelligence is very different from IQ, which is the intelligence that we have naturally by birth and, by perhaps by studying. But emotional intelligence is really our ability to be have that self-awareness. And self-awareness, you can't have self-awareness unless you are present. And it's not only to be self-aware, but it's also to learn how to regulate that self-awareness. So again, if you know that you are somebody who has high levels of emotional intelligence, this conversation, it's going to be really good for you, because it's going to help you, again, use those skills to be better at listening. If you're somebody who perhaps that you're not as high in emotional intelligence. By the way, emotional intelligence is something that can be learned. So you just got to listen and practice being better. Practice, because the more you practice, the better you get at increasing your emotional intelligence. Stephen, does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and there's been a whole lot of things happening. And one of the things that everyone is been talking about is the Simone Biles pulling out of the Olympics, and and she talked a lot about what she's dealing with, the pressure that she's feeling, and how that pressure has affected her emotionally, which has affected her physically. And the first thing, and for me, by the way, I heard, the first time I heard it through the lens of judgment. Like, oh my God, how could she? This is the most important time in her life. How could she do this? And then as I'm preparing for this show about listening, I realized that I was not listening. She was talking to all of us. She was actually talking to the world and expressing what it is she was going through. And and there were many people who, instead of listening, they heard what she was saying, but they were hearing what she was saying through that lens of judgment, through that lens of evaluation, through that lens of, yeah, but, you still shouldn't have done that. And that is what listening is not. That may be hearing somebody, but hearing, it's very different than listening. What are you thinking, Stephen?
I'm thinking that there's a lot of people that processed what Simone did the same way, because even I did. That the first reaction, and it's right on point of not completely listening was, I mean, I came from an angle of, oh my God, that's so horrible for her, like all this time and effort and these hours and all this preparation and practice, and it was for nothing here now for this Olympics. And like you said, Elix, the more I paid attention and understood and listened, that angle changed.
Yeah, and I be honest with you, I got really, as the moment it clicked for me, I actually became very upset when I heard people, high profile people, by the way, being so dismissive of what she's telling us, how she's feeling, how, the level of anxiety, it's really can really impact somebody's performance, everything that you do. I mean, imagine if somebody who has anxiety, and they're not high profile athletes, they suffer, right? Imagine this woman who's being seen by the lens of the entire world, through the lens of she must do whatever she has to get to the goal. I imagine what that feels like, and I became very, almost like defensive, because I felt she needs to be heard, and this is a really good segment, a segue to the conversation that we're going to have today, because that happens in everyday conversations that we're having, whether it's with family, whether it's with your spouse, with your children, or with colleagues at work. So when we come back, it's about, I think we're going to take a little break. We're going to talk a little bit about the role that listening plays in your life. I'm going to talk to you about, of course, my mentor, Judith Glaser, who is the person that introduced the, 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 the tool listening to connect, and that it's really what helped me expand my ability to listen from a very from a much deeper perspective. So we're gonna dive into all of that when we come back. If you have something to say about this conversation, if you relate to this conversation and you want to join us, you can do that. 508-222-1320, and we'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Get a Grip with Coach Elix. I am your host, Coach Elix, and with me is my co host and husband,
Stephen, the medium.
Stephen the Medium. And we are talking to you today about listening and what great listeners actually do. And, in the previous segment, I talked about the difference between hearing and listening. And, we started talking about, the Simone Biles and how many people responded to that situation, not really listening to what she was saying, but just hearing what she was saying from their own judgment and evaluation. So think about the role that listening plays in your life, in everything that we do, whether it's our professional life, what percentage of your day or your job depends on listening to someone or someone listening to you, because listening is a two-way conversation frequency. How often do we have disagreements, arguments, misunderstandings, and those disagreements, those arguments or misunderstandings resulted from someone, not hearing what you have to do, not understanding where you are coming from, and you experience not feeling heard. Or they hear you, you know that what they heard has been distorted in a way, which again is not really experiencing not being heard. And Stephen, I mean, you and I feel so lucky that we, that I have a deep knowledge of this conversation, because there's often times where you and I have to pause and say, listen, you're not hearing me.
Yes.
And but think about how valuable that is. Like when you say to me, I'm not hearing you, it immediately has me pause. And and it's almost like the red flag that allows me to have that self-awareness that says, oh, okay, I'm doing that thing again. I'm listening with some judgment. I'm listening with some evaluation, and he's experiencing not being heard. And that's me and Steven, but that can happen with anyone. Now,
Well, that Elix, not to interrupt, but
yeah, yeah.
that also was not like that example you just gave. That wasn't like our lives when we first met, and for many years. I mean, that's just how complicated I think listening is. For us to be where we are now took a lot of years.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I've been a coach for 20 years. We've been together going into 29 years. So yeah, we had a number of years where I didn't have training in this conversation. And even when I started getting training, this is not something that, overnight, oh yeah, I'm now a great listener. It takes a
Right.
lot of practice, and it takes a lot of correction. One of the things that got me much better at listening was the training that I did with my hero, my mentor, a woman that I admire so much. She passed away several years ago from pancreatic cancer, Judith E. Glaser. She is the founder of Conversational Intelligence. She's the author of Conversational Intelligence, How Great Leaders Build Trust and Get Extraordinary Results. By the way, that's a book that everyone should read. So make a note of it and go get it, because it will help you improve the conversations that you're having, which, by the way, begin with the conversations that you're having with yourself. What I've learned, one of the very important things that I learned through the training that I received from Judith and the mentorship that she offered me while she was alive, is the distinction. It's called listening to connect. And listening to connect is about focusing your attention on the other person without judgment or rejection. It's about listening. It's about really tuning in to what are they trying to say, what are they thinking? What are they hoping you will get them to explore? It's about connecting to somebody else's world, to that other person's world, and explore their world, not from the lens, your own personal lens, but explore their world through their lens. And it requires, talk about being present. This listening to connect requires your utmost attention, and it's bigger than listening to understand. Like, oftentimes people will say I understand. Saying I understand doesn't necessarily means you're listening to connect. Listening, when you say listening to understand, it's more about listening to confirm something that you already know. Listening to connect requires your deep commitment to really get on that person's world. And let me tell you, they will know whether you're authentically getting their world or not. Because if you say you are, but their experience still is, I'm not feeling heard, what they'll get is, well, he's not being authentic. He's just saying whatever he needs to say to get by. But I am not experiencing that connection. I am not experiencing being heard at that deep level. Stephen, what are you hearing here?
I'm hearing so many conversations that people have. I think it's more common than what most people, when they like sort of step back and think about. It's more common than ever. And I'm sure, again, the example you just gave is, conversations happen, and the person who's listening that may not be authentic, that just doesn't even know, probably in many cases never knows.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, we Stephen, you're probably gonna crack up when I tell you this, but when I think of listening to connect, Stephen and I, by the way, we are Golden Girls freaks. We are Golden Girls is playing in this household every day.
Is that a TV show?
But I don't know if you'll know which episode I'm going to talk about, but there's one episode
yes.
where there's a conversation with Dorothy.
Yes.
And Sophia.
Yes.
And Dorothy is, she goes on a date with this guy that she thought had stood her off during her prom, I believe it was. And, it wasn't that. It was actually Sophia that told him to go away because she didn't think that he was dressed appropriately, and she didn't think that he deserved to go with her daughter to the prom. But Dorothy never knew this, so she goes on a date, she learns the story, and she comes back to the house, and she sits with the mom with the goal of asking her mom, is this true? Right? But she simply asks, she begins to say, is this? And Sophia, as soon as Sophia starts to say, explaining the situation, Dorothy says, liar, and interrupts her right away. And that, to me, that is a perfect example of what most people do every single day. Think about that. Now, you may not say liar loudly, like Dorothy said to Sophia, but you may not be liar, but you in your head, how many times do you go into a conversation with someone when you ask the question, but you already know what the answer is? You already know what it is you want to hear. And it doesn't matter what they say. In your head, if you don't hear what it is that you think they should be saying, that's exactly what you're saying. Liar. I don't believe you. You're not telling me the truth. And that is a perfect example of what listening to connect or listening in general is not. What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And again, I just think this is I love that you're doing this subject because it is just on one level it just seems like it's just so simple, but on every other level it's just not.
No, and again, if you are committed to being an extraordinary husband, wife, son, daughter, partner, friend, colleague, leader, boss, whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that you're committed to, listening is perhaps one of the greatest tools that will create the opening for you to be that. But it's something that requires a whole lot of practice. Now, listening is very often a forgotten skill. Sometimes a lot of people take listening for granted. Again, we say things like, I heard you, I hear you, but you're not really listening. You're not really stepping into that other person's world. We don't practice it consciously or consistently because again it's sort of like that skill that we just take for granted. We have two ears and we hear whatever we hear, but that's not listening. So listening to connect takes it requires that you practice and you be intentional and consistent in that practice. We also assume that we listen effectively. We're oftentimes we're that arrogant, that we assume that we listen, except that if the other person is not experienced being heard, then you're not listening. And then while most of us are born with the ability to hear, many of us are not taught how to practice actively listening to connect. And that's what we're going to do here today. It's about time to take a break. We're going to take a break and we're going to talk about things that you could do to practice actively and intentionally listening to connect. If you want to call us, 508 222 1320. We'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Get a Grip with Coach Elex. I am your host, Coach Elex, and with me is the one and only,
Stephen Frederick Masick.
the medium, and also my husband.
And attorney.
And attorney.
Yeah.
Jeez. And we're talking today, our conversation is about listening and what great listeners do. Oftentimes we confuse, like I said before, hearing with listening. Hearing is passive listening, is the automatic process of perceiving sound. We all do that. You don't even have to do anything to passively listen. Active listening, on the other hand, requires making a conscious effort to pay attention, to notice, to observe, not just the thoughts, but also the feelings, what is happening within yourself. Now, there's many benefits of listening, and in particular, listening to connect, and not just listening, but listening to connect, as Judith Glaser would have taught us. When we listen to connect, we make better friends, we make better parents, we make better partners. In business, we make better decisions, and we become better leaders for the present and for the future. When you listen to connect, people open up. Again, think about that time where you know that other person hurt you, that you truly experience being heard by somebody, not being listened to, but being heard. They connected with you in that deep level. Listening to connect also helps us avoid misunderstandings, because you're not stuck in your world. As Stephen would say, you're present, you're really connected to that other person's world, and it helps us resolve conflict. When you are when you're mutually connected with each other, it creates that opening to be more empathetic, to really understand what's happening in that other person's world. It also builds trust. When we're listening to connect, we are engaging that part of the brain where trust, lives, that prefrontal cortex, that executive brain, and it helps us have better conversations that are driven by trust, not fear. And you all know the difference between fear-based conversations and trust-based conversation. And it positively changes people's attitudes towards themselves and towards others. And it shows a level of emotional maturity. Now, going back, at the beginning of the show, we talked about Simone Biles pulling out of the Olympics, and how many people, she thankfully, she had a lot of people who responded very positively to her, which shows how we connected, we listened, we really got in her world, but many others didn't. There were a lot of people who said very nasty things or responded very negatively to that decision. And that's a perfect example of what happens when we're hearing somebody, but we're hearing somebody through our own lens. So instead of, many people may have said something like, what in the world is she thinking? What in the world is what in the world are you thinking, Simone Biles? Instead, we may say something like, gee, I would like to learn more about what's going on with her. What is the real driver behind the decision? Is she hurting? What are those emotions that she's feeling? And that creates that opening to listen, to connect. So again, I'm using that example because it's something that we all know, we all heard, and we're all watching the Olympics, so it's very real right now. But you can think of any situations that you're personally dealing with, again, whether it's at home or is at work. So let's talk about specifically, and again, I'm using the work of Judith Glaser, who is the founder of Emotional Intelligence and the author of the founder of Conversational Intelligence, and the author of Conversational Intelligence, How Great Leaders Build Trust and Get Extraordinary Results. So she has encourages us to practice 3 ways to be a better listener. And the first thing is to understand, be aware of the current situation that you find yourself in. So when you converse with someone else, do you try to understand the purpose or the goal or the interaction? Whether it be just chat, to have difficult conversations, to move mountains, understanding the intended goal that allows us to clear our minds of any preconceptions or conclusions that could stand in the way of a successful conversation. So it's really, again, it's about that situational awareness. Is taking the time to prime ourselves for connection so that we can translate that positive intention into our listening behavior. So again, it's almost like hitting that pause button and just first and foremost understand what is the current situation. What is it that I'm trying to convey to this person? What is that person trying to convey to me? And really putting ourselves in each other's world. Stephen, what are you hearing here?
No, there's just too many levels, Helix. Here, there's I don't know. It almost feels as if this was maybe like 10 years ago, and I was listening to you, I don't think I would. I think I would be, I don't know, being exposed to so much, like very overwhelming. Thinking that up until this point, I'm a good listener, and that wasn't the case. I just think this is so interesting.
Yeah, and that's why we're having this conversation, because it's an opportunity for all of us to sort of ask ourselves, how good of a listener am I? How good of a listener am I? And by the way, the answer is in the results that you have. Take a look at your results. How good of a relationship do you have with your husband, with your wife, with your partner, with your children, with your colleagues? Are you having effective ways of communicating with them? Do you avoid challenging conversations? Because that gives you an indication that you may not be as good of a listener as you think you are. So again, be aware. And again, Stephen, I go back to what you said at the beginning, how being present, it's so key, because if you are not present, you can never have that situational awareness, because you're not present.
Right.
The only awareness you have is whatever's happening in your head. That will create a roadblock to listening to connect. Now, the second thing is power with others. And I love this because there's a lot of people, especially managers, bosses, that are really good at having power over others, telling people what to do, giving, like being somebody who is like speaks over you. When you're with them, you experience this sense of I'm less than, because they have that tendency. Power with others is the complete opposite of that. When we mutually share in building our relationship, both parties experience the positive power of the exchange. So closing the distance between yourself and others enhances and validates both people's power. So again, power with other is taking that moment to really do whatever you need to do to get on that other person's world. Is that clear, Stephen?
Yes.
And the third thing, it's my favorite, and something I have practiced doing a lot. It's called, Judith Glaser calls it double clicking. So think of when you have a computer and you have a mouse and you have to double click to open a file. Double clicking originated when two rapid computer mouse clicks open up folders and documents and conversations. Is a metaphor, however. Is this Judith Glaser described it to explain clicking twice on specific phrases in conversations to open up the meaning others may hold inside. Doing this enables us to analyze, take apart, interpret, and understand the meaning of conversations to make sense of what both parties intend to communicate. Now, double clicking is very simple. Double clicking is simply asking something like, tell me more about that. I like to better understand what you said. What do you mean about that? Say more. That is what double clicking means. And I double click all the time. When I'm with clients and they share something and I'm not quite sure what it is, where they're coming from, where they're going, I double click. Say more about that. And that is one of the most powerful ways, one of the most powerful things that you could do that will create the opening to enhance listening and to improve the conversations that you're having with others. So it's about time to take a break. We're going to finish up this conversation when we come back. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. And hello, everyone, and welcome back. Happy Friday. Welcome to Get a Grip with Coach Helix. I'm your host, Coach Helix, with my husband and better half co host,
Stephen F.
Stephen F. Masick, the medium.
Yes.
That's where you can find him. And it's interesting. All I'm going to say, Stephen, is thank God I have self-esteem on my side, because our producer, we're having a conversation about listening. I'm asking questions during the break, and I hear nothing. And then what? And so clearly he's not listening to these conversations. So you may want to, listen to the podcast or the recording, Mark. Just saying. But thank God I have self-esteem on my side. But we're talking about listening to connect, and what great listeners do. One of the things that I believe is that when you are emotionally intelligent, you actually that allows you to be a better listener. So, what is it that people with high levels of emotional intelligence do that others don't? Well, the first thing is they have self-awareness of their biases. That's perhaps one of the most important things. Without that self-awareness of their biases, they would lack the ability to listen and listen effectively. So people who are have high levels of emotional intelligence are first and foremost very self-aware of their own biases. Now, Judith Glaser came up with the concept of the ladder of conclusions. Chris Argyris calls it the ladder of inference. In essence, they're almost the same. What it means is that every single one of us as human beings, we're always climbing the ladder, which means we're always reaching conclusions based on assumptions. So that's what we do. That's part of our human makeup. You always climb up. You're always reaching those conclusions based on those biases, based on those assumptions. So people with high levels of emotional intelligence learn to master their ability to question the assumptions. In other words, climb down the ladder. We climb it up anyways. That's something we're going to do. It's part of our human, mechanism. But what most people don't do or don't know how to do is to climb down the ladder. So learn to question assumptions. One very easy way to learn to question assumptions is have a conversation with someone else and ask them to help you question those assumptions. That's a way that you climb down the ladder, and that's a way that you can practice and gain mastery at gaining more self-awareness of those biases that we all have. That, again, that's part of our human makeup. So that's one thing. Second thing that you could do is practice on collapsing the what happened with that narrative that you make up about the what happened. See, as human beings, it's almost all automatic. Almost all the time, something is going to happen, and immediately you make up some narrative about what happens. The problem with that is that as soon as those two worlds collapse, they become one. And notice that with time, what we speak of as a fact, as the what happened, is not really the fact, but a narrative that you made up. And as human beings, we tend to add a lot of evidence that our narrative are actually the truth, except that they're not the truth. They're narrative. They're made up stuff. But you are relating to made up stuff as the truth. And that becomes very problematic, because if you're relating to a narrative as the truth, whatever that narrative is, that's going to get in the way of you listening to connect to someone else. So you got to collapse. You got to separate. And the moment you separate, that allows you to be crystal clear that, oh, this is what happened versus this is what I made up happen. So, for example, a lot of my clients, I work with a lot of business people, and somebody may say to me, my boss offended me. I already know that statement is a narrative. That is not a what so, because that my boss offended me is some narrative about something that happened. So I asked them what happened. Specifically, what did they say? What did they do? And the moment you on collapse, well, my boss said I am not, not coming to work on time repeatedly. Oh, okay, that's what happened. The narrative, my boss offended me. And often what we do is we take that narrative and we relate to it as a fact, and that becomes very problematic in listening, and in particularly listening to connect to that other person's world. The last thing, by the way, is as a person with high emotional intelligence, is to learn to self-regulate those emotions. So when you know you're hot, learn to hit the pause button. First of all, learn to practice self-awareness, to understand I am upset. And at the moment, having a conversation may not be a good idea because I am upset. Hit the pause button on collapse, what happened versus the narrative that you're making up. And then again, learn to self-regulate. Learn to say, you know what? I am not in a position to respond. I am not in a position to have a conversation right now. But when I am, I then will be in a position to express authentically how I feel. So that again, it's not listening to connect. It's not just getting in somebody else's world, but it's also about you being willing to be vulnerable to allow somebody else to get your world. Stephen, what are you hearing here?
Again, a lot. The story piece of this is, I think, for me anyway, it's sort of like a highlight, because so many times you've made that story up, but you have no clue or no idea you made that up.
Absolutely. And the problem,
it's hard to get out of it.
Well, yeah, because the problem with that is that we don't think of it as a story.
Right.
We think of it as the truth. And we hold on to that truth like our life depends on it. But that becomes very, very problematic. And that, by the way, that can ruin relationships. People have gotten divorced because of that. People stop talking to friends because of that. People leave jobs because of some story, some narrative that you made up about something that happened, and you hold on to that as the truth. By the way, there's many times where, as years pass and of course you let go, you forget, you're no longer attached to that same emotion, and you may reconnect with that person and have another conversation and realize that what you thought was the truth had nothing to do with the truth.
That's amazing.
Lost a lot of time in the meantime. Does that make sense, Stephen?
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
So here's your assignment for those of you who are listening. Your assignment is, in your next conversation, notice what you're thinking while the other person is speaking. Just pay attention. That's practicing being emotionally intelligent. Most of us are spending time listening, getting ready for what we're going to say. Don't. Pause. Say nothing. And just really notice. Notice what's going on in your head. Notice what it is that you're saying about what they're saying. And just take an opportunity to just really pause and listen. And so that's your assignment. And again, let me just say, this conversation today was mainly due because of the incredible work of Judith Glaser. So I highly recommend any of you listening, if you want to learn more about conversational intelligence, I want you to look up Judith's book, Conversational Intelligence: How Great Leaders Build Trust and Get Extraordinary Results. By the way, you don't have to be, a CEO. You don't have to be a big shot at any business. This is a book that will make a difference for anyone, and it will help you improve any conversations that you're having, including the conversations that you're having with yourself. So we got to the end of our show. Stephen, tell people what are you up to and how people can connect with you.
You can connect with me at Stephen the Medium. No matter what social media is, that's where you can find me.
Stephen the Medium. And what is it that you do, Stephen?
Well, that's the $1 million question, because I can do a lot of stuff. But if you want me to narrow it in, I speak to dead people.
That's right. So if you have loved ones and you want to connect with your loved ones, you want to connect with Stephen the Medium, or check him out. He's absolutely amazing. I guarantee it. And if you want to connect with me, you just find me at Coach Elix, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And if you want to have a conversation with me, just book a session with me on my website. By the way, my website, Lindsay Darling, finished my website. There's a few things that are still, work in progress, but I think it looks amazing.
No, it is incredible.
So if you haven't checked it out, go check it out. My website is simplycoachelix.com. So
it's not simply Coach Elix, right? It's Coach Elix?
It's coachelix.com. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our show. I hope you have a fabulous rest of the weekend wherever you find yourself. And I look very much forward to continue to connect with you. So you can find me again next week, 1 p.m. Or you can find Stephen and I again next Wednesday at 5 p.m.
Yes.
For Through the Static. And our producer, Mark, you can find him Wednesdays at 3. Yes. For his show. What's the name of his show again, Stephen?
Mock's Jukebox, dear God. Are you listening?
Well, no, I want to know if he's listening, and this is a test. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Bye, everyone.
Bye.